And next we're going to talk about machine applique. I absolutely love doing applique, and it is my first love in quilting. This is my little reference card that I have. So I have some scraps of applique, and what I do is I go through and I test many of the decorative threads that you have on your machine. I will actually put the stitch number, the width of the zigzag or the width of the stitch, what my length, and what my tension is set at. That's very important. So if I want to reproduce this stitch, I just have to dial up these figures. Again, this one almost looks like chicken feet. My tension, stitch number, width, length, stitch. So this one's almost your standard satin stitch. And remember, there are many things more than a satin stitch. All those beautiful decorative stitches you have on your machine that we don't usually use, we can use that. And here's your standard blanket stitch. So one of the things about raw edge applique is the edge is raw. So if you're doing a blanket stitch, if you're going to wash this, a blanket stitch will not work because the edge will start to fray and you'll see all little whiskers in there. So if it's going to be washed, you need to do a stitch, a satin stitch, or some kind of stitch that encases the raw edge. Especially if you're doing a baby quilt. I did one once and I used a beautiful blanket stitch and I thought, great, and I washed it before I gifted it, and all my applique frayed and I had to go back and satin stitch everything. So that was my learning lesson. So important when doing applique, you must always have a stabilizer behind it, and it's always a tear away. Unless you're doing a knit, and then you're going to actually fuse a stabilizer onto the back of it. A stabilizer is essential for supporting the stitches. Also, you need to use an applique foot, which is much different than the standard foot. And the biggest difference is underneath. In this foot, there's a channel for your decorative stitching to run through. On a regular foot, there is no channel. It's just flat here. You'll get very unsatisfactory results by using your standard foot. You should always use the appropriate foot for the stitch. So on the brother, it is our applique foot. And of course, it has a slot in the middle because most applique stitches are centered and then they either go to each other's side. Right. So I've put some yellow embroidery thread into the machine, and I just have a white bobbin. So keep in mind that when you do applique stitches, you want them to come around almost like a U, and the bobbin is shorter. So that wraps those stitches around the edge of the applique fabric. So when we get talking about embroidery stitches, I'll explain that a bit further. So let's go ahead and put on our applique foot. So I have a couple of samples here, just standard leaves, and I'm using a yellow embroidery thread so you can see. So let's first start off with the blanket stitch. So in our section number 2 on the Luminaire, we have our standard decorative stitches. Number 3, we're getting into more complex ones. So if you look in number 2, you'll see here's our standard blanket stitch, but they have a bit of a variety on it. So where the straight stitch is, it's a double and a single. Number 4 is just all single stitches. Then we have our little scallops. I can scroll down here. We have some very interesting zigzags. This is almost a free motion, a meander. Number 20 would be your standard satin stitch that we'll do in a minute. let's go up and let's pick number 3. Now, when you start appliquing, don't start at a point. Always start in a bit. I always like to start up about right here, just like maybe a quarter up. Now, you always want to do a sample first. You will always have scraps of your applique, fuse it to some fabric, put some stabilizer underneath, because you're going to have to adjust the bite of the zigzag on here. So if I go ahead and start, so I have the edge of my fabric right in the slot or the cut in the foot. So I'm nice and slow. So I can go ahead and start. You can see that I'm way over here. So obviously I need to be over a bit. This is why you practice first. So I've now moved the edge of my fabric over to the left. So I've got that lined up. Now that bite is a bit big. So let's put our needle down. Now if we can see, to me that's a big bite, but we can adjust that, or you may be perfectly happy with that one. But let's go. And I'm adjusting the width. It's actually at a 3.5. Let's go to a 2.5 and see how that stitches. Oh, that's a much nicer bite. So you can see it's doing the one zigzag, stitch, stitch, the double stitch, one bite. That's actually quite nice. And we can see that our bites are nice. So those are those who test first, and then those who spend a lot of time ripping out our stitches. That's usually me. So we can do a bit more, and then we're going to change to a different stitch. So I'm going to let it complete and then stop. Needle down. Okay. So now let's pick the single, because that one had a double straight stitch. Let's go to a single. And let's see how this works. Single, bite, single, bite. So that one you could go a bit faster on. When you're just starting with machine applique, start slow. And you want to practice, practice, practice. And a great way of practicing is just get yourself one of those panels and pretend they're appliques and stitch around them. Needle down. So you can see here where we had the double straight stitch, and there's the single. So it's just a little bit more effect going. Okay, so let's go. Now I'm going to put my needle up, and let's try our standard satin stitch. Okay. Now, the default on stitch number 20 on this machine, the zigzag's pretty big. So what we're going to do is I'm going to realign myself up, and we're just going to take it at its default. Oh, that's a big stitch. So let's just do a little bit of it. And you'll notice that I'm slowly turning it counterclockwise with my left hand. So we can see now how big that bite is. And if this was me, I would have my stitches a little closer because I like a nice fill. So let's go back and let's change the width. So let's go ahead and use our stylus pen. So I'm just going to put the blue here so we can see a bit better. Okay. So let's make our zigzag a little skinnier. So I'm going to hit the minus, hit the light, and then go down to what I think is appropriate. And it's nice because it's projecting on here what it looks like. That's good. Let's try that for a bit. So as we're layering the zigzag stitches, and you can see how important it is to have a channel on the bottom of your foot. So now we can see it's smaller, so that's much nicer. I'm liking that a lot more, but we need to have our stitch length a little smaller. So I'm just going to put this under here so you can see better. So our length, we need to make our length a little shorter. So light. And of course, the beautiful thing about the projectors, I can actually see them on. So let's try that and see how that stitches. So we're really putting in the zigzags there. Again, another important reason you have a channel underneath the foot. Okay, let's see how that is. Oh, that's looking much nicer. Look at that. That's much, much nicer. I could even probably go a little skinnier, but you know, for a leaf, I think that's mighty fine. So let's go up to the end here. I'm just going to speed up a bit. And I'm going to show you how to do a point. So if this was my sample, I would actually take a permanent marker like a Sharpie or whatever it is and write right on this sample what my stitch width is, what my length is, the stitch number, tension if I've had to adjust the tension. So I want to get right into the edge, and it looks like I have a couple more stitches left. So if I stop on the left hand side and I go to pivot, I'm going to have a gap or a V at the top. So I want to be on the top there. Now I can lift up. And what I need to do is I'm going to come across here. I want to come across here and then down here. You only need a couple of stitches there to make that turn. 1, 2, I'm just doing needle up, needle down. There. And then I can start to pivot my leaf. Down a bit. Okay. Goes, and there's my point. Right. Now I could have made that a hard point or a slightly rounded one, which is what I actually did. So we stopped up at the top here, pivot, and then it went down, down, down. So the important thing to do when you're doing applique is when I join back over here, I want to make sure I secure that stitch. It's more important to secure your last stitches than your first ones. I typically do not secure my first stitch. I always stitch over top and then stitch in place. I tend not to use the reverse stitch because then you're just adding more stitches and it makes it look a bit messy. But if you stitch in place, that's with the open dot on your machine, stitch, 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 and then it's secure and it will not come undone. Okay. There we go. Now let's look underneath. As you can see, my bobbin stitches are small and the top stitches are wrapping around, and that's exactly what should happen when you're doing machine applique. Yeah. And then when I'm done with this one, I would just tear off my stabilizer, square up my blocks and sew them together. So that's why this is really, really important to do. If you feel like sitting one afternoon at your machine and actually trying out all your decorative stitches that you have, you should do that.